Well, I would say that the shift really happened straight after September the 11th. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, if I may just quote from straight after September the 11th, what I actually said on this issue. When I reflected on the terrorism, that we know these groups of fanatics capable of killing without discrimination. The limits on the numbers that they kill and their methods of killing are not governed by any sense of morality. The limits are only practical and technical. We know that they would, if they could, go further and use chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons. We know also that there are groups of people, occasionally states, who will trade the technology and capability of such weapons. And then I go on to say, you know, we've been warned and we should act on this warning.
Yes,
so
but
I would say it's not really about the President Bush axis of evil speech or anything else. I think after September the 11th, it was clear this whole thing was in a different framework.
Yes, but my point was, how did we intend to respond to the change, the shift in the American policy, not the shift in your thinking, which we've heard earlier, but how did we intend to respond to that?
We intended to respond by saying, from now on, we have to deal with it.
So the preparation for the meeting at Crawford that took place at Chequers, I think was a preparation meeting for Crawford. And according to Alistair Campbell's diaries, you told Chequers meeting it was regime change in part because of WMD, but more broadly because of the threat to the region and the world. That's true?
Yeah, I mean, I think these things were sort of conjoined, really. I mean, the fact is that it was an appalling regime, and we couldn't run the risk of such a regime being allowed to develop WMD. Can I just make one point here, which I think is quite important as well? Of course, it was President Clinton in 1998
Indeed.
that signed the Iraq Liberation Act, and that policy of regime change became the policy of the government.
As I say, I'm aware of that because it became more active, as I said.
Yes, but can I just make this point, because I think it's very important. If you study the detail of that act, the reason he comes out for regime change, President Clinton, is because of the breach of United Nations resolutions on WMD. And so there is a way, I think, you can get a sense, and some of this has come in the evidence, as it were, the Americans are for regime change, we're for dealing with WMD. It's more a different way of expressing the same proposition. The Americans, in a sense, were saying, we're for regime change because we don't trust he's ever going to give up his WMD ambitions. We were saying we have to deal with his WMD ambitions. If that means regime change, so be it. So it wasn't that we kind of came at this from completely different positions.
So in preparation for this meeting at Chequers, what kind of conclusions did you reach and what advice were you being given by your advisors?
Well, basically, we were obviously now going, you know, we'd had the military action in Afghanistan. It was obvious that the American system, indeed our own system, were now going to look at this WMD issue. And there was advice on options as to containment and regime change and so on and so forth. So all those options were being explored. And as I say, following that meeting and before I went to see President Bush, there was quite an intense interaction on this whole issue that Sir Roderick was raising with me about smart sanctions, because I needed to get a sense whether this policy was really going to be a runner or not.
But why was the Chief of Defence Staff present at this meeting?
Because it was very obvious that the American system certainly wasn't going to rule out military action. And, you know, from a very early stage, I could see coming down the track, I mean, straight after September the 11th, frankly, that there were going to be some very difficult decisions about this in the future. So one of the things that I always tried to do, particularly if military action was even a possibility in the paper, it made it clear it was a possibility, to get the Chief of Defence Staff right alongside the discussion and the planning and the policy.
And what advice did he give you at that meeting? Because I think you'd asked the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary to produce papers.
Yes, the Defence...
And these papers were discussed. But what advice did the Chief of Defence Staff give you at that meeting?
Well, he was laying out again various options on the military side, and he was expressing his view. I think Mike Boyce told you about this in his evidence that you know.
No, indeed, actually, Mike Boyce doesn't remember being at that meeting, although it is in Alistair Campbell's diary. So I'm afraid we don't have that information.
Well, I mean, I remember him being at it, and as I say, we got the paper from the Ministry of Defence, and that was looking at the various options. But you know, one of the things that was happening at this time, and I think it's quite important to reflect on this, is that this was very quickly becoming the key issue. People were moving on from Afghanistan. It was always going to be on the agenda once you had September the 11th, and as I say, a different sense from everybody that we had to act. And so we had a perfectly good discussion about it. And obviously, I think from the defence point of view, what CDS and the Ministry of Defence were concerned about was to make sure we got alongside any planning that was going on and did it as quickly as possible. And
was the Foreign Secretary at that meeting?
I believe he was, but let me go back and check.
Because we heard from Jack Straw about the advice he gave you in advance of that meeting, which is the one that's already been referred to. But we have heard that while there might have been some private differences at the time between you and the Foreign Secretary over the desired final objective, whether regime change was the objective, you agreed on the tactics, namely that it would be essential to go to the United Nations because without that it would be not possible for the cabinet or anyone else to support military action. Is that a correct?
Yeah, absolutely, Baroness. I mean, I think the other thing that was very important to me at this time was to try to get the international community on the same page with the threat and how we dealt with it. And, you know, straight after September the 11th, people came together behind America. But I was very aware right from the early stages of this that although the American mindset had changed dramatically, and frankly mine had as well, when I talked to other leaders, particularly in Europe, I didn't get the same impression really. And so one thing I was really anxious to do, because we'd put together a coalition on Afghanistan, was to try and put together a coalition again to deal with Saddam Hussein. And therefore the United Nations route wasn't just that it was important for all sorts of political reasons, legal reasons and so on. It was, I mean, to do with the internal politics of the UK. It was also important to me because I didn't want America to feel that it had no option but to do it on its own.
So are you saying to me that that was the kind of the agreed policy with which you went to Crawford, on the eve of Crawford? Is that what you intended to achieve at Crawford?
I mean, what we tended to achieve at Crawford, frankly, was to get a real sense from the Americans as to what they wanted to do, and this would be best done between myself and President Bush, and really to then get a sense of how our own strategy was going to have to evolve in the light of that.